The internet is our modern campfire, a place where millions gather in the digital glow to share tales of wonder, humor, and of pure, unadulterated terror. But unlike the ghost stories of old, whispered from one person to the next, these accounts are typed out, raw and immediate, often just moments after the author's heart has stopped pounding in their chest. And no place is a more fertile ground for this new age of folklore than Reddit. Among the memes and discussions, there are corners of the site where users share experiences so chilling, so deeply unsettling, they feel like they could only be true. These aren't tales of distant castles or ancient curses. They are stories that happen in suburban homes, on lonely night shifts, and on the hiking trails you thought you knew. They are stories that could happen to you. Tonight, we're dimming the lights and scrolling into the abyss. We have scoured the archives, read through countless threads, and selected 5 stories that have burrowed deep under our skin. These are accounts of encounters with the unexplained, the malicious, and the things that lurk just at the edge of our perception. Prepare yourselves. These are 5 of the scariest true horror stories ever posted on Reddit. My girlfriend, Chloe, and I were ecstatic when we found the apartment. It was in one of those old, pre-war buildings with high ceilings and thick walls, the kind that feels solid, permanent. The rent was surprisingly low for the area, a fact the landlord, a fidgety man named Mr. Corbin, attributed to the building being a bit dated. We didn't care. It had character. It had space. It felt like a real home. The first few weeks were perfect. We unpacked. We painted. We made the place ours. The thick walls were a blessing. We barely heard our neighbors. In fact, we rarely saw them either. The hallways were usually empty, hushed. It was a quiet building, which suited us just fine. The first strange thing happened about a month in. I was working from home, sitting at my desk in the living room, when I heard a faint scratching sound. It seemed to be coming from inside the wall that our couch was pushed up against, the wall we shared with the adjacent apartment. I paused, listened. It was rhythmic, insistent. Scratch. Pause. Scratch, scratch. I assumed it was a mouse, maybe a rat. Old building, old problems. I made a mental note to buy some traps. But the sound didn't stop. It would come and go at odd hours. Sometimes it was a light scratching, other times a more deliberate, heavy thump. Thump, thump, thump. Chloe heard it too. She was more unnerved by it than I was. It doesn't sound like an animal, she'd say, her ear pressed against the floral wallpaper. It sounds intentional. I told her she was letting her imagination run wild. Then came the whispers. It started so quietly I thought I was hearing things. Late at night, when the city outside had finally quieted down, I'd hear it. A soft, sibilant murmur from the other side of the wall. It was too muffled to make out any words, like listening to a television through a thick pillow. I figured it was just our neighbor. A lonely old man, perhaps, who talked to himself. I mentioned it to Chloe, and her face went pale. She had been hearing it for days, but was too scared to say anything. The real fear began when we realized our neighbor was a middle-aged woman who worked as a nurse and was, according to the mail in her box, almost never home. We'd see her maybe once a week, a flash of blue scrubs disappearing down the hall. The apartment should have been empty most of the time. But the sounds continued. The scratching, the thumping, the incessant, inaudible whispering. One night, the thumping was louder than ever. It was a solid, percussive bang against the wall, right behind our heads as we tried to watch a movie. Fed up, I stood up, marched over to the wall, and banged my fist against it 3 times. "Hey," I shouted. "Could you keep it down in there?" Silence. The thumping stopped. The whispering, which had been a low hum beneath it, ceased. Chloe looked at me, a mixture of fear and relief on her face. For the rest of the night, there was nothing. Absolute silence. We thought, foolishly, that I had solved the problem. The next morning, as I was leaving for work, I saw Mr. Corbin in the hallway. He looked even more anxious than usual. He asked me how we were settling in, and I told him it was fine, but that our neighbor was a bit noisy. Mr. Corbin's face lost all its color. He stammered, "Neighbor? But apartment 4B has been vacant for 6 months. The last tenant, she passed away." In the apartment, my blood ran cold. I stared at him, then at the door to 4B, then back at him. "That's impossible," I said. "We hear things from in there. All the time." "Mister." Corbin just shook his head, mumbled something about old pipes, and practically ran down the stairs. I stood there for a long time, the silence of the hallway pressing in on me. I went back inside and told Chloe. We spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet dread. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the building, sent a fresh jolt of fear through us. That night, it was worse. The thumping returned, but it wasn't just a thump anymore. It was a frantic, desperate banging, like someone was trapped, trying to break through the wall. And the whispers, they were clearer now. Not words, but a single, agonizing sound. A long, drawn-out moan of pain, rising and falling, over and over. It was the sound of pure misery. We huddled together on the far side of the room, as far from the wall as we could get. We called the police. When they arrived, we explained the situation, told them about the vacant apartment, the sounds. They were skeptical but agreed to have the landlord open the unit. Mr. Corbin arrived, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the keys. The two officers entered 4B, flashlights out. We waited in the hallway. We could hear them moving around inside. After a few minutes, one of them came out. He looked confused. "Apartment's empty," he said, "and covered in a half-inch of dust. No one's been in there for a long, long time." He told us old buildings make strange noises and that we should try to get some sleep. They left. We were alone again. But as Mr. Corbin was locking the door to 4B, something caught my eye. On the inside of the wall, the very wall we shared, I could see long, deep gouges in the plaster. Scratches, dozens of them, running from the floor to about waist height. And at the bottom, near the baseboard, the wood was splintered and dark, stained with something I didn't want to identify. It looked exactly like someone had been scratching, clawing, and throwing themselves against that wall from the inside. We broke our lease the next day. We packed our things in a frantic hurry, not caring about the security deposit. As I was carrying the last box out, I paused at the door and listened one last time. From inside our apartment, coming from that shared wall, I heard it again. A faint, weak sound. Scratch. Pause. Scratch, scratch. It was waiting for the next tenants. I took the job because I was desperate. The ad was vague. Night attendant for private archive. Excellent pay. No experience necessary. Must be able to follow instructions precisely. The interview was even stranger. It was in a sterile, windowless office with a man who never introduced himself. He just slid a single sheet of paper across the desk and said, "Read this. Memorize this. Your life will depend on it." I thought he was being dramatic. The pay was triple what I could make anywhere else, so I played along. The paper contained a list of rules for my shift, which was from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., alone, in a massive, climate-controlled warehouse that supposedly stored sensitive documents. The first few nights were easy. The place was silent, cold, and dimly lit by emergency lights. My only job was to sit at a desk by the entrance and watch a bank of security monitors. Most of the rules were simple. Rule: do not, under any circumstances, leave the front desk area. Rule: a delivery will be made at precisely 3:33 a.m. Do not interact with the delivery person. Take the box they leave and place it in chute 7. Do not open the box. Simple enough. But some of the rules were odd. Rule: between 2 a.m. and 2:15 a.m., the power to camera 12, which monitors the far northwest corner, will fail. Do not attempt to fix it. Do not look down that corridor with your own eyes. Keep your gaze fixed on the other monitors. Rule: if you hear a woman singing, cover your ears and hum loudly to yourself until it stops. Whatever you do, do not listen to the melody. I followed them, of course. The money was too good not to. On my first night, at exactly 2 a.m., the monitor for camera 12 fizzled into static. I felt a primal urge to look down the long, dark corridor to my right, but the man's words echoed in my head. Your life will depend on it. So I stared at the other screens until, at 2:15 on the dot, the feed blinked back to life, showing the same empty, silent corner. The delivery at 3:33 a.m. was always a heavy, cold metal box left by a figure who never showed their face, their features always obscured by shadow, and a wide-brimmed hat. I'd take the box, my fingers going numb from its chill, and drop it into the designated chute, hearing it clatter far down into the earth. For a month, this was my routine. It was creepy, but manageable. I started to get complacent. I figured it was some elaborate psychological test, or maybe the owner was just an eccentric paranoid. The singing started in my second month. It was beautiful, ethereal, and seemed to come from everywhere at once. I remembered Rule, slammed my hands over my ears, and hummed Happy Birthday at the top of my lungs like a madman until the celestial, tempting voice faded away. My heart hammered against my ribs. It had felt so real. The real test came on a Tuesday. I was sipping stale coffee when I noticed something on the monitor for aisle 9. A book. It was lying on the floor where no book should be. The archives were immaculate. Nothing was ever out of place. This broke a fundamental rule of the archive itself. But there was no rule on my list for this. I watched it for an hour, my anxiety growing. Should I report it? There was no one to report to. Should I get it? Rule was clear: do not leave the desk. Then, at 1:45 a.m., I heard a sound that wasn't on my list. A child's giggle. It was coming from aisle 9. I froze, my eyes glued to the monitor. The aisle was empty. But the giggle came again, closer, clearer. It sounded like it was just outside the range of the camera. I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. There were no rules for this. Then, a new rule flashed in my mind. A rule that wasn't on the paper, but I knew it with absolute certainty. It wants you to come look. It wants you to break the rules. My hand hovered over the console. I had a joystick that could pan and zoom the cameras. Against my better judgment, I nudged the joystick for camera 9, trying to see around the corner. The camera whirred audibly through the building's speakers. The giggling stopped. In its place, a whisper slithered out of the main speaker on my desk. "I see you." My blood turned to ice. I snatched my hand back from the controls. And then I saw it. On the monitor for the main entrance, the one pointed at the front door, a set of small, muddy footprints were appearing on the polished concrete floor, walking from the door directly towards my desk. They were appearing out of thin air. One step at a time, getting closer and closer. I remembered Rule: do not leave the front desk. I was trapped. I squeezed my eyes shut. I could hear the wet slap of the muddy feet on the floor, getting louder, closer. They stopped right in front of the desk. I held my breath, waiting for a touch, a voice, anything. The silence stretched for an eternity. Finally, I dared to open my eyes. The footprints were there, leading to my desk, and stopping right in front of my chair. But there was nothing there. Just empty air. I let out a shaky breath, thinking it was over. That's when my phone rang. It was the landline on the desk, a phone that had never rung before. I stared at it. There was no rule for the phone. Hesitantly, I picked it up. "Hello." The voice on the other end was a dry, rasping sound, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. It said, "You broke the rules." You looked, and then it laughed, a horrible, tearing sound. Behind the laughter, I could hear it. The beautiful, ethereal singing from Rule. I had heard the melody. The line went dead. At that exact moment, every light in the building, including the emergency lights and my monitors, shut off. I was plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. And from the corridor of camera 12, the one I was never supposed to look down, I heard a slow, heavy scraping sound. It was the sound of something large dragging itself along the concrete. And it was coming my way. I didn't wait. I broke Rule. I scrambled out of my chair, vaulted over the desk, and ran. I fumbled for the emergency exit, my hands slapping against the cold metal wall until I found the push bar. I burst out into the pre-dawn air, gasping, and ran without looking back. I ran for miles. I never went back for my last paycheck. Sometimes, late at night, when it's too quiet, I can still hear that beautiful, terrible singing in the back of my mind. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to my very soul, that it's looking for me. It's a melody you only need to hear once. We adopted Buster from a local shelter. He was a big, goofy German Shepherd mix, all paws and floppy ears, and we fell in love with him instantly. He was a bit timid at first, which the shelter staff said was because of his past. They'd found him abandoned, tied to a fence on a rural road. But he warmed up to us quickly and soon became a confident, happy member of our family. He had one quirk, though. He hated our guest bedroom. From the day we brought him home, he refused to go in there. If we threw his favorite toy into the room, he'd whine at the doorway, looking back at us with pleading eyes, but he would not cross the threshold. We thought it was strange, maybe a bad memory associated with a scent in there, but we didn't think too much of it. We just kept the door closed. Our house was a single-story ranch, pretty standard for the suburbs. The guest room was at the very end of the hall, next to our master bedroom. It had one window that looked out over the backyard. We barely used the room. It just held an old bed and some boxes. The behavior started about 6 months after we got Buster. Every night, without fail, at around 3 a.m., Buster would wake up from his spot at the foot of our bed and let out a low, guttural growl. It wasn't his normal, "I see a squirrel" bark. This was a sound of genuine menace. He would stand there, perfectly still, his body rigid, hackles raised, and stare intently at our closed bedroom door, growling deep in his chest. The first few times it happened, it terrified me. I'd get up, check the locks, peek out the windows. I never saw anything. I'd try to calm Buster down, but he was inconsolable. He would just stand there, staring at the door, for 10 to 15 minutes, until, as if a switch was flipped, he would relax, shake his whole body, and hop back onto the bed to sleep. My husband, Mark, thought it was a raccoon or a possum outside that only Buster could hear. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Buster wasn't looking at the door, he was looking through it, at something in the hallway. Something just outside our room. One night, I decided to test a theory. When Buster started his nightly growling ritual, I quietly slipped out of bed. Mark was a heavy sleeper, so he didn't stir. I crept to the door, my heart pounding. Buster's growl intensified, as if warning me not to open it. I ignored him. Taking a deep breath, I slowly, silently, turned the knob and pulled the door open just a crack, peering into the dark hallway. There was nothing there. Just the familiar shadows of our home, the faint glow of the night light in the bathroom. I felt a wave of relief. It was just Buster being a weird dog. As I started to close the door, Buster let out a sharp, loud bark and lunged forward, pushing past me into the hall. He ran straight to the guest bedroom door and started scratching at it frantically, barking and snarling like he was trying to get at something inside. Now I was truly scared. I turned on the hallway light. Buster was going ballistic, throwing his body against the door. I grabbed his collar and dragged him back into our room, his claws scraping against the hardwood floor. I shut our door and locked it. Whatever was happening, it was centered on that room. Buster didn't stop growling at our door for an hour that night. The next day, while Mark was at work, I decided I had to know. I opened the guest bedroom door. The room was cold, colder than the rest of the house, despite the summer heat. The air was heavy still. I stepped inside, my skin prickling. Everything looked normal. The bed was made. The boxes were stacked neatly in the corner. I walked over to the window. It was locked from the inside. Nothing seemed out of place. As I turned to leave, my foot snagged on the corner of the area rug. I stumbled, catching myself on the bed frame. When I looked down, I saw that the corner of the rug had been folded back, revealing a dark, ugly stain on the hardwood floor beneath. It was about the size of a dinner plate. I knelt down, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch the floor. It was old. The wood was slightly warped, as if something had soaked into it a long, long time ago. That's when I noticed the smell. A faint, coppery, sweet-smelling odor, like old pennies and rotten meat. I scrambled out of the room and slammed the door shut. I called Mark, crying, and told him what I'd found. He came home early. He agreed it was creepy, but he was rational. He said the previous owners probably just spilled something. But he couldn't explain the cold or Buster's behavior. We did some digging online that night. We looked up the history of our house. We found old news articles. 20 years before we bought the house, a man had lived there alone. He was a recluse. Neighbors reported him missing after not seeing him for several weeks. The police did a wellness check. They found him in the guest bedroom. He had taken his own life. The article didn't give details, but it didn't need to. I knew, with a sickening certainty, what that stain on the floor was. We sold the house 6 months later at a loss. We couldn't stay there. Even after we found out, Buster's nightly ritual continued. That low, menacing growl aimed at the hallway, at the room where a lonely, desperate man had ended his life. We never knew what he saw or what he sensed in that hallway every night. But I know he was protecting us. He was standing guard, warning away a lingering sadness, a persistent shadow that still considered that house its home. He was a good boy. He knew. This happened when I was in college. I used to take the last bus home every Tuesday and Thursday after my late-night lab class. The route was long, winding through some of the quieter, more desolate parts of the city before reaching my neighborhood. By that time of night, around 11:30 p.m., the bus was usually empty, save for myself, the driver, and maybe one or two other tired commuters. I'd always sit in the same spot, about halfway back, next to the window. I'd put in my headphones and just watch the city lights blur past. It was a peaceful, mindless routine, until one Thursday. He got on at a stop in a poorly lit industrial area, a part of town I'd never seen anyone get on or off before. The bus hissed to a stop, the doors folded open, and he climbed aboard. The first thing I noticed was that he didn't pay. He just walked right past the driver, who didn't seem to notice or care, his eyes glazed over and fixed on the road ahead. The man was tall and unnaturally thin, wearing a heavy wool coat that was completely wrong for the mild autumn weather. His face was hidden in the shadows of a deep-brimmed hat. He walked down the aisle, his footsteps making no sound on the rubber floor, and sat in the seat directly across the aisle from me. I immediately felt a prickle of unease. There were dozens of empty seats, but he chose the one right next to me. I tried to ignore him, turning my head to look out the window, my music suddenly feeling too quiet. But I could feel his eyes on me. I could feel the intensity of his stare, even though I couldn't see his face. It felt like a physical pressure on the side of my head. I risked a quick glance. He hadn't moved. He was just sitting there, angled towards me, perfectly still. I couldn't see his face, but I could see his hands, which were resting on his knees. They were pale and long, with dirty, jagged fingernails. The bus rumbled on, stop after stop, but no one else got on. The last remaining passenger got off, leaving just me, the driver, and the silent man in the coat. The atmosphere on the bus grew thick, heavy. The air felt cold. I pulled my jacket tighter around me. He finally moved. Very slowly, he raised one of his long-fingered hands and tapped on the seat next to him. Tap, tap, tap. It was a clear invitation. I pretended not to notice, my heart hammering against my ribs. I stared determinedly out the window, watching familiar landmarks go by, counting the stops until mine. Only 5 more. He tapped again, harder this time. Tap, tap, tap. I squeezed my eyes shut for a second, my mind racing. What does he want? Who is this guy? I decided to just get off at the next stop and walk the rest of the way, even though it was over a mile. It was better than being on this bus with him. As the bus slowed for the next stop, I stood up, grabbing my backpack. I didn't look at him. I just started walking towards the front of the bus. As I passed his seat, a cold hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was like iron. I gasped and tried to pull away, but it was no use. I finally looked at him. He lifted his head, and I could see his face in the dim overhead light. It was awful. His skin was waxy and pale, stretched tight over his skull. His eyes were wide, round, and completely black, like polished stones. And he was smiling. His lips were thin and bloodless, pulled back from a set of yellow, uneven teeth. It was the most predatory, inhuman smile I have ever seen. He didn't say a word. He just held my wrist, smiling that terrible smile, his black eyes boring into me. The bus doors hissed open. I panicked. I yanked my arm with all my strength. For a second, his grip held, and then, miraculously, my wrist slipped free. I didn't hesitate. I scrambled to the front of the bus and practically fell out onto the pavement. The doors closed behind me, and the bus pulled away. I stood there on the curb, shaking, my wrist throbbing where he had grabbed me. I watched the bus's red tail lights disappear down the street. And then I saw him. He was standing in the back window of the bus, his pale face pressed against the glass. He was still smiling. He raised one long, white hand and gave me a slow, deliberate wave goodbye. I ran. I ran all the way home, not stopping until I had slammed and locked my front door behind me. I never took the late bus again. I dropped the class, took the grade hit, and rescheduled for the next semester. I'll never know who or what that man was. But I know that if I had sat down next to him, if I hadn't been able to pull my arm away, I would not have gotten off that bus. Not ever. My friends and I used to rent a cabin in the mountains every fall. It was our tradition. We'd hike, fish, and sit around the fire, disconnected from the world for a weekend. The cabin was old, rustic, and owned by a local guy who rented it out for cheap. It had no TV, no internet, and barely any cell service. It was perfect. This particular year, it was just me, my best friend Liam, and his girlfriend Maya. We arrived late on a Friday night. It was colder than usual, and a thick fog was rolling down the mountainside, blanketing the woods in an eerie silence. Inside the cabin, we found a new addition. On the dusty mantelpiece above the fireplace sat an old, shoebox-sized tape recorder and a stack of about a dozen cassette tapes, held together with a brittle rubber band. There was a yellow sticky note on the recorder. In messy, spidery handwriting, it read, "Found these in the attic. Good for a spooky night. Listen, but do not listen to the last one. Bill." Bill was the owner. We were intrigued. That night, after a few beers, we decided to listen to one. Liam popped in the first tape, labeled simply Tape 1. He pressed play. The recorder hissed for a moment, and then a man's voice filled the room. He sounded old, his voice a gravelly whisper. He was talking about the woods around the cabin. He called them the Hungry Woods. He spoke of strange disappearances over the years, of hikers who went in and never came out. He described sounds at night, whistles that mimicked birdsong but were just slightly off, and a soft crying that would lure people off the trail. It was creepy, but we chalked it up to local folklore Bill had recorded to spook his guests. The next day, we went for a hike. The fog hadn't lifted, and the woods were unusually quiet. No birds, no squirrels, just the sound of our feet crunching on damp leaves. We didn't go far. There was an oppressive feeling to the forest that day, a sense of being watched that made the hairs on our arms stand up. We cut the hike short and went back to the cabin. That night, we listened to more tapes. The stories got darker. The man on the tapes, who we started calling the narrator, talked about a creature in the woods. He never described it clearly. He only spoke of its presence, a feeling of dread, the sudden, unnatural silence that fell whenever it was near. He talked about seeing things from the corner of his eye, something tall and thin moving between the trees, too fast to get a good look at. On tape 4, his voice was shaky. He said it had come to the cabin. He'd seen a face in the window, pale and long, with eyes that were too far apart. By tape 6, we were all on edge. The narrator was no longer just telling stories. He was documenting his own terror. He sounded like he was losing his mind. He spoke of waking up to find muddy, three-toed footprints on the porch. He described hearing scratching at the door, a slow, methodical sound that went on for hours. Liam wanted to stop listening, but Maya and I were morbidly curious. We had to know how it ended. We put in tape 7. The quality was worse. The narrator was whispering, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It knows my name," he whispered. "It's calling for me from the trees. It sounds like my mother." He broke down, sobbing, begging for it to leave him alone. The tape ended abruptly with the sound of the cabin door splintering open and a high-pitched, inhuman shriek. We sat there in stunned silence, the crackling of the fireplace the only sound. Liam immediately ejected the tape and threw it into the fire. "That's it," he said, his voice trembling. "We're done. This is sick." We tried to forget about it, to brush it off as a prank. But the atmosphere was ruined. Every creak of the old cabin made us jump. Every gust of wind whistling outside sounded like a voice. We all went to bed early, locking the doors and windows. I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bunk, listening to the sounds of the night. Around 2 a.m., I heard it. A soft scratching sound. It was coming from the front door. My heart stopped. I told myself it was a branch, an animal. But it was too rhythmic. Scratch. Scrape. Scratch. It was the exact sound the narrator had described. I was paralyzed with fear. I could hear Liam and Maya stirring in the next room, so I knew I wasn't imagining it. The scratching stopped. Silence. Then, a voice. It was a soft, gentle whisper, seeming to come from right outside the window next to my bed. It was a woman's voice, and it said my name. I have never known a fear like that in my entire life. It was a cold, absolute terror that rooted me to the spot. It knew my name. Liam let out a choked scream from the other room. It had used his name, too. We huddled together in the main room until sunrise, armed with fire pokers and kitchen knives, listening as the voice circled the cabin, whispering our names, sometimes sounding like our parents, sometimes like our friends. It was trying to lure us out. As soon as the first gray light of dawn broke through the fog, we ran. We didn't pack. We left everything behind, piled into the car, and sped away down the mountain, not looking back. We never talked about what happened. We never went back to that cabin. But I still have nightmares. And I always think about that last tape, the one Bill warned us not to play. The one that wasn't labeled with a number, but with a single, horrifying word. Introduction. The silence that follows a truly terrifying story is a heavy one. It's a silence filled with new fears, with the reevaluation of shadows and the sudden distrust of a creaking floorboard. The stories you heard tonight came from ordinary people who found themselves in moments that were anything but. From a watchful presence in a vacant apartment, to the chilling rules of a job no one should ever take. From a loyal dog protecting his family from an unseen sorrow, to a nightmarish encounter on a city bus, and a voice in the woods that knows you by name. These tales remind us that sometimes, the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones in movies. They're the ones that exist in the quiet corners of our own world, waiting to be seen. What did you think? Which story will be keeping you awake tonight? Let us know in the comments below. And if you have your own story you'd like to share, we'd love to read it. If you enjoyed this descent into the dark, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more content like this. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss another tale from the shadows. Until next time, stay safe and be careful what you read online. You never know which stories are true.